trying to work in Afghanistan and address some of the problems that Afghan people are facing there. And I'm referring to World Food Program. We have the country director of World Food Program, Mr. Christopher. Thank you very much for joining. Now, the session, and you would find that there are at least 3 sessions today where would be having a threadbare discussion on humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. There is this session where we are trying to understand and capture the magnitude of problem that the region is facing and what can be done. Then in the afternoon, we would have with us Mr. Moeed Yusuf, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, National Security Advisor, from 3 to 4, who would again be discussing the situation in Afghanistan. And then at 4:30, from 4:30 to 5:30, we'll be joined by the SAPM on CPEC, Mr. Khalid Mansoor, and Chinese ambassador to Pakistan, so that we could understand the repercussions of regional development on CPEC and what are the counter strategies for it. But to begin with, and of course, what I believe, and I wrote a piece a few weeks ago in the news, where I had said that no one can disagree with the demand of international community, especially the Western world, about an inclusive government in Afghanistan, about the Taliban respecting human rights, fundamental rights, women's rights. So there is absolutely no denial to it, and unless and until they meet these demands, of course, world shouldn't recognize them. But then it seems a bit of unfair that if we, the intended beneficiaries of those demands, we are punishing them because they are being ruled by a group of people in whose selection or in whose coming into power, those people, they had no role to play. And it looked like it is throwing a baby with the bath water. And this is the whole ambience of the crux of discussion. We know UN organizations, they have been trying to address this situation. We also know that there's this Geneva process, and High Commissioner perhaps would be able to ask her comments about this Geneva process. How is it going on? So the format would be that we'll start with the scene setting, 5 to 7 minutes per panelist, and then we will make it an interactive conversation. And of course, at appropriate time, we'll also take questions from floor as well as online. So Harun Sharif, if I can request you to please give us this morning espresso, start some scene setting, and then I'll come to the other distinguished panelists.
Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. Many thanks to Sustainable Development Policy Institute for organizing the whole conference, and very appropriate and timely topics which has affected all of us and rest of the world, and how to deal with it. So thank you, Abid, for the kind introduction. Honorable friends, panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. So the topic today, as introduced, is that we need to look at Afghanistan in particular, but I will take a minute to speak about the region. So the region as a whole is going through a major transformation. And it's not only one-off thing. We have seen the emerging, rise of Asia and China. We have seen tensions in the Middle East. We have seen, I was just showing a photograph to Ambassador Nagmana, which came from His Highness Mohammed bin Salman's office. He was sitting with the Emir of Qatar yesterday. So things are changing at a very rapid pace. And then we saw this US-led alliance rather abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan. As a history, because some people who know me, I have been an advocate of looking at regional issues from an economic lens for quite some time. But somehow the strategic side and security continues to trump that argument. And in the Doha dialogue, there was a demand that we actually look at a medium-term economic offer for Afghanistan as well. And I led that discussion. But at the end of the day, it was a deal which led to the withdrawal. With this background, I have been working on Afghanistan and the region for several years, and now for the past year and a half with more focus. So a few things I would like to highlight. I think all of you and all of us know that severity and the precarious nature of humanitarian crisis. Nobody can deny that. Because a country which was dependent 70% on external outflows to actually run the state affairs, now suddenly that money has dried up. IMF funds, their reserves have been, blocked. The disbursement have been stopped. So obviously the country is in a big way short of money. I will not go in detailed fiscal assessments, which I have seen. Practically, the country cannot pay the bills, as simple as that. But that is the country situation. The most pressing needs at the moment, other than actually having, payments of essential salaries and stuff to education and health and government servants, this crisis had already started when US decided to leave from the Bagram, post at that time. So the money started shrinking. But I'm told that salaries were not even paid at President Ghani's time for several months. So there is a crisis of, livelihoods. There is a huge crisis of a country which was already short of, multiplied that. I'm told that there are, donations and vaccines, lying unused in Afghanistan because there are no health workers available to actually vaccinate the country, and less than 18% of population is actually vaccinated. So there's a health crisis very clearly seen in Afghanistan. Food crisis, I will not go into detail. We have Mr. Kriske, he will come into that a country where poverty is more than 50%, $1 a day. But if you take $2 a day, it's much, much higher. So we have the humanitarian crisis very clearly because of the fiscal gaps, because of the delivery system's failure. I would like to highlight that there is a trust deficit because the delivery system which Americans and the donors had set up, it was expensive, it was corrupt, it had limited outreach, and people really, their faith and trust on that system hasn't really evolved to own that. Now that system has vanished. Now the question is, we have left with limited options to deliver humanitarian assistance. And I'm sure my colleagues will elaborate it more. So one of the points to think in today's session would be that how could, the neighboring countries and the Western countries who have left can look at, some kind of adequate delivery system for Afghanistan, because otherwise you can't reach out to the people of Afghanistan. The other point I would like to highlight is that there is an absolute absence of financial market or banking system. So even if you have the pledges materialized for Afghanistan, how would you transfer money to Afghanistan? Because there is the Western countries are, I think now, thinking between a trade-off with the ideological differences with the Taliban regime versus the people who are suffering. Now, how do you do that in an absence or a vacuum of a financial system if you don't want to give money because of sanctions and we haven't recognized them to the government? So second point is very critical to think that we need to get some relaxations on transfer of funds through some kind of financial instruments. Otherwise, Hawala and Huddi, I'm told, is the only mechanism to transfer money to Afghanistan. Now, with these kind of crises which we are seeing, and with very harsh winter, I would like to, in the scene setting, raise few questions to discuss today and think about it. My first bigger question is that is humanitarian assistance enough to actually support Afghanistan and the region, because it appears that it's a very short-term approach that we will help this time. What will happen afterwards? Can we give hope to the very young labor force in Afghanistan to look at, these days nobody thinks about long-term, but at least a medium-term direction of a revival of the country, which promises some jobs, which promises, some institutional building, which promises actually neighbors holding hands and coming forward, so that people actually see hope in the nation state, which can go on. So that's the bigger question, which we all of us need to think about. The risks are very, very grave in many angles if the country goes further down. Or get into, unfortunately, in a warlike situation because of the fight for resources. So informal economy, there's a good part of Afghanistan's informal economy because that ensures livelihoods to a certain degree. But turning that economy into an illegal trade will not take long time, because if the legal trade barriers are still there, so then perhaps, the arms trade and the drugs trade and, a desperate person could do anything for barter, because this is a country which is 80% import dependent. Afghanistan imports almost all of its energy needs, be it electricity or oil, from outside. Now, who will pay the bills if they don't have the cash? Afghanistan imports around 30 to 40% of wheat to feed their people. And the best market they import from is Pakistan. Pakistan itself is actually struggling with the food security issues at this point in time. So these are the questions which I think in today's session in course we will raise. So one is that, how can we look at a little medium-term outlook for Afghanistan? B is, that a country which is import dependent with no hard cash, what could be the innovative ways to deal with it? Now, it's heartening to see that in Geneva conference, some $1 billion worth of pledges came for Afghanistan. I don't know how many of these actually get translated because of these barriers. But at the same time, one has to see the reality that we cannot take Afghanistan, which has dealt with very serious conflict for 40 years, as a normal partner country. If you give aid and put the usual conditions that, you need to tick this box, there are prior actions, there are girls schooling and others, I would raise this question that is it, fair at this point in time, or is it doable? Who will monitor all that? So these are the dynamics of actually starting, giving cash. There are some programs in Pakistan which can be expanded and help. The cash transfer program in Pakistan, which was Benazir Income Support Program, and later now the addition of a SARS program, has some systems developed which could actually be replicated. Similarly, large NGOs like National Rural Support Program have been reaching out to people in Pakistan, and one could see how neighbors can help and how West, rather than using the traditional contractors and others, could do. So in closing this, that there is a risk of, procurement, because they don't know. There is a risk of capacity. There is a risk of illegal trade. There's a risk of declining trade. A country which heavily dependent on agriculture-based employment. There is a risk of, exports, agriculture exports shrinking. So how do we deal with all these risks? And how do we progressively mainstream Afghanistan? There are 2-3 scenarios. It could be a high intensity conflict coming up. There could be a medium or low intensity conflict coming up. So it's very tricky to design interventions in that scene setting. Pakistan and the neighbors, particularly China, perhaps should raise the game in medium term. How would they do that? Because, so far for years and years, it's the multilateral system and Western countries which have been, working on a system which clearly was not sustainable. And how do we take it forward? So these were some thoughts in scene setting. Unfortunately, not a very pleasant scene setting in the morning, but that's the reality which is hitting us. So do we deal with a reality, Or do we still basically look at ideologies and traditional instruments which have not really worked in Afghanistan over the years? That's where I would like to close and hand it over to Dr. Soleri to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arun Sharif, for presenting a very factual ground picture of Afghanistan, what needs to be done, and of course, how it would happen. That is a big time question. I would request High Commissioner Gilmore to present her views on this topic. I know that Canada was part of Geneva conference, and Canada must have got some recommendations there as well. So being a very influential northern country, which is respected in terms of its being non-controversial in this whole scenario, we thought to seek your views on it, that how do you see this whole situation, and in the Geneva discussion, what are the way forward, some of the way forward that you could think of? Here or here, whatever. And in the meantime, I'm also trying to chat with our friend Melinda Good, the country director of World Bank Afghanistan. She may not be able to join, but she has promised that she will put Mr. Andrea online for the banking channel. So let me see that how quickly he can join us.
There we go. That's better. Thank you very much, Dr. Soleri. SPDI, this is an annual event that certainly I and many of my diplomatic colleagues look forward to every year, as a collection of some of the best minds in Pakistan who come together to look at real challenges of development, not only in Pakistan, but in the region more broadly. And of course, right at the moment, there is no greater challenge, I think, to Pakistan externally than the situation in Afghanistan. Certainly the international community recognizes that Pakistan has been a host nation for a significant refugee population for the last 40 years. This has had a significant impact here. It's an issue for the region. And I think it is absolutely clear that not only Afghanistan's neighbors, but the rest of the world want an Afghanistan that is stable, that can take care of the needs of its own people, that is not going to be a source for further international instability, in particular, a source for further transnational terrorism. And how that's going to happen remains at the moment a very open question. Canada is clearly, as are many of our partners in the donor community, committed to Afghanistan and the Afghan people. There is no question of that. We will continue to do all that we can to support the Afghan people. But we're concerned. We're very concerned with the prospect of a government in Afghanistan that is not necessarily looking out for the interests of its own people. Our engagement has always focused on peace, security, democracy, human rights, and particularly the rights of women and girls. I know many of you have probably heard me before, have known a little bit about Canada. We have fundamentally at the core of our foreign policy, at the core of our international assistance policy and humanitarian policies, the rights of women and girls. We are a feminist international assistance policy, a feminist foreign policy. We had been really encouraged by the gains that Afghanistan had made over the last 20 years with respect to human rights, education, health. Maternal mortality had been halved in that period. Child mortality had significantly improved. Access to basic healthcare significantly improved. Access to education, particularly for girls, had significantly improved. And the prospect of all of these gains being lost due to an administration in Afghanistan that is not committed to maintaining those gains is extremely worrying, if not heartbreaking. So Canada, like many of the other countries, you mentioned the Geneva process that was underway, are working hard with the multilateral agencies, and we're going to hear from Chris, to try and ensure that the basic needs of the Afghan people are met, that the humanitarian needs, and frankly, a humanitarian plus environment in which basic needs can be met, particularly in health and education. That's what we're trying to focus on in such a way that we are going to be responding directly to the needs of people on the ground. In the meantime, we are working with the de facto administration in Afghanistan to try and encourage a number of things. First and foremost, we want the Taliban administration to live up to the commitments that it had made through the Doha process to an inclusive government that accounts for all of the peoples of Afghanistan, that it lives up to commitments in basic human rights, especially for women and girls, access to education, access to means of livelihood, access to basic human needs, food and services and medical needs. We expect any government in Afghanistan to uphold these fundamental elements as required by international law. At the moment, we haven't seen the performance that we need to that would allow us to unblock significant amounts of humanitarian assistance. And I've said this again to other audiences, Afghanistan has been the single largest recipient of Canadian development assistance over the last 15 years. We continue to be a major humanitarian donor, and for this way, we're looking to the UN to be as creative as possible. We're looking to the World Bank to be as creative as possible to ensure that monies coming from the donor community are funneled directly to recipients. We've committed at this point for this year alone, $77 million, Canadian dollars per se, but still that's quite a sum of money to support, in particular, World Food Programme, UNHCR, the ICRC, OCHA, UNICEF, and other humanitarian agencies to be able to deliver this support. But we will continue to press the de facto administration, as I said earlier, to live up to its commitments. If they demonstrate they are willing to do so, if they demonstrate that they are able to support the delivery of human needs, we will be in a better position to support Afghanistan writ large. It is up to the Taliban to demonstrate this. And that's the fundamental element. I would say just one other element that is really important, particularly for a country like Pakistan, as I said already, which is a major host nation for refugee communities. In line with the Global Compact on Refugees, Canada is committed to supporting regional countries to support its refugee population, to take care of the most vulnerable that do not believe that they are safe inside Afghanistan and then seek to leave. In Canada, we have made a commitment to accepting 40,000 Afghan refugees in the immediate term. We welcomed the commitment made by the de facto administration, the Taliban, to allow safe passage for these refugees. We encourage them to continue to do so. We would also encourage Pakistan to ensure that it is supporting those that are the most vulnerable, that are able to come across borders. We encourage all regional nations to keep their borders open to these most vulnerable. And we're going to continue to work with allies and partners to ensure that we are best positioned to help these vulnerable Afghan citizens. So I'm going to stop there. I think that's my 5 minutes or so. I don't want to go on beyond my time, but really looking forward to the discussion and very happy to take up any of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, especially for also highlighting FIAP, this Feminist International Assistance Policy, one of the key pillars of Afghan diplomacy and Canadian diplomacy, and of course, basic principle that sets your this development engagement with other countries. And of course, when we look at Afghanistan from FIAP lens, perhaps things they are not as bright, but then the aspect that Harun was highlighting, that still remains there. To get further about it, may I request Christopher for the humanitarian assistance plan by World Food Bank, how the things they are shaping up, evolving, the pledges, how those can be materialized, and then I'll request Ambassador Hashmi to give us some regional overview.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Saleri, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity of address this forum. share the views of Wendy of just how important and how valuable this week is for us to understand, I think, the breadth and depth of issues that impact on our world. Those of us involved in providing and supporting the Pakistan government, particularly in addressing the development challenges, need to have that bigger picture and understanding of what's happening around us. So certainly Afghanistan is there's no bigger challenge. We've heard from Dr. Haroon who mentioned that. You know, as country director of the World Food Programme here in Pakistan, I'm not an expert in any means in what's actually happening in Afghanistan, although I did work there 20 years ago when the Taliban was in charge then. So I have some familiarity, and it's a kind of demonstration of the fact that the humanitarian organizations have been there in force and in some in depth as well for decades. And we have built up an incredible relationship with the people of Afghanistan as a result. Now that helps us. It enables us to fulfill our role, our obligation to really be able to cover the needs of people without any due regard to politics. And that's really, really vital. 22.8 million people currently are acutely hungry in Afghanistan. There's 8.7 million of those people who are one step away from catastrophe. What's a catastrophe? That's famine. If we get to a state of famine in Afghanistan, and we really are only one step away for 8.7 million people, we've really lost it. We've lost the fight. Famine is when people start dying because they don't have enough to eat, and we're not far away. There's 1 million children currently at risk of dying from malnutrition. Afghanistan's healthcare system, as we've heard, is already on the brink of collapse. Only 4.3 million people have received one dose of the COVID vaccine. The education system is threatened with 70% of the teachers currently who are not being paid. Access to safe water will become an ever greater challenge in a context where already 8 out of 10 Afghans already drink unsafe water. The implications for the health and safety of the most vulnerable is severe. Now, since August, there's been a 4-fold increase of people using extreme negative coping mechanisms just to survive. And you've seen it on the television. People are selling their children. Now, we know Haroon has already indicated, I think, that the economy is in free fall. It was already in decline because of poor growth and the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19, the dependency of foreign aid. Now that civil servants are not being paid, the facilities, the health facilities are at risk of closure. You know, more and more people are selling their household goods on the streets. Construction and factories are closing shop. The middle class that really should be the backbone of society is falling into food insecurity. So the contraction of the economy and our inability to arrest that contraction is the biggest and major concern in the immediate as well as in the long term. Now, in the meantime, so what do we do? Humanitarian response is, of course, the best and the most immediate solution. As I've indicated, we can operate in Afghanistan freely, probably more freer now than we were before the 15th of August, which is somewhat intriguing. But nevertheless, we have to have the requisite resources to be able to do so. The World Food Programme is doing all it can to reach the 23 million people who are food insecure. Now, we have reached in the regions of 13 million people so far this year. That's a cumulative figure. But we need to be able to ramp up and expand the numbers of people that we're reaching on a monthly basis. In September, it was 5 million. In October, we reached 6. We should reach 7 million people in November. And as the flow of food,
thank you. That's excellent. See,
with the help of Pakistan, is increasing, thanks to the increased pipeline and the assistance that we're getting at Karachi port, the opening of the borders in Shaman and Torkham, the efficiency by which we're able to transfer and move food through the country. We will be able to increase that. Pakistan isn't the only corridor that we're using. The other major corridors are also coming in from the north. So that's important, but the race is on to beat winter. In those northern areas, the Wakhan corridor, they're already being closed down because of snow. We need to be able to pre-position food within the next 2 or 3 weeks if we're going to be able to provide for those people in those marginalized areas. And it's critical that we do, because the lean season, which is the period through which crops are grown, is going to be even more distressed this year than ever before, largely because we haven't been able to get the seeds into the ground. There have not been enough seeds available for farmers. And above all, the country has been suffering from an extensive drought, which has made it even harder for farmers to be able to till the ground and to be able to increase their productive capacity. So the prognosis is extremely concerning, you know, humanitarian assistance is at the moment the best and the only apparent solution. That is the thing that we need to be able to address. We need to be upfront and honest about that. That whilst it's very important, while we need the international community to be as generous as the Canadians have been, indeed as many other countries have been, we're still a long way short. The World Food Programme requires $2.3 billion to address the food security needs in 2022. We're close to having received $1 billion, but we've got an awful long way to go if we're going to be able to secure the food requirements of people who are on the brink. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much for informing us about the ground situation. Of course, famine, catastrophe, drought, food insecurity, starvation. And it reminds me that perhaps we are talking of a couple of decades ago when there used to be plane hijacking. Some hijackers who have held the passengers hostage, and now we are discussing and negotiating whether we like the faces of those hijackers or not, or will be able to feed the passengers or not. And if I remember there was this hijacked plane in Karachi airport, and at least at the airport authorities, they were providing them the food while they were stuck in the plane. It was a long time ago. So the whole country looks like but I'm thankful to Melinda Good, country director of World Bank in Afghanistan, for joining us at a very short notice. I only texted her this morning and then kept on persuading her. Thanks, Melinda. Melinda was busy in another meeting, so she has joined us for a short period of time. But the main question that we wanted to ask from Melinda is about the banking channel. Yes, the pledges are there. World Food Programme has explained the humanitarian situation. So there is a consensus that something needs to be done for the people of Afghanistan. But how will it happen? That's another big question. $2.3 billion is for humanitarian aid, maybe $5 billion for this question to answer this question, that how would it happen? So Melinda, over to you. I know you are running short of time, but whatever time you would like to take to apprise us of the ground situation in Afghanistan, and what are the World Bank's plans? How would you like to move ahead? Arun, do you have any question to add?
I would just add something to Melinda's, presentation, that what is the likelihood of revival of World Bank assistance to Afghanistan, and where are you at this point in time? I understand there's a good, overview of the situation she's leading. But the key is that when the money starts flowing.
No, Abid, thanks for inviting me, and I'm sorry I couldn't get there in time to join all of you. I'm currently in Islamabad, actually, and I think Abid didn't know that, so I really appreciate the opportunity to join. And Harun's question is actually the easier one, so let me start with that. And for that, it's almost as if we had had a dance with WFP, because the World Bank assistance will hopefully be starting soon to support the WFP work that was just described. And that's also linked to this very difficult question about payment systems that Abid asked. And I don't know if you've already started discussing it, but I can sort of frame how we're seeing this. It's linked to two things, both the current very deteriorated economic situation and the humanitarian response. Right? I think probably Harun set the stage, but even before the collapse of the government, Afghanistan was facing huge economic and development challenges. It had slow economic growth up through August, and it was rapidly deteriorating. Now, Chris was describing sort of what's happened in terms of access, which is some good things that have happened since then. But with the freezing of assets overseas, and with basically putting on the brakes on the financial sector, what's happened in the interim is that assistance is very limited to the absolutely needed but very basic humanitarian work that our incredible colleagues in WFP and UNICEF and others are doing. I think he described how things are going across the border from here, and big kudos to Pakistan for the role that it's played there. And so this is why, as the World Bank, which is also a collective, was thinking through what to do in the very immediate term and how to do it. We decided together with the partners in the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is 31 donor countries, right, that take us all the way back to 2002, 2003. How do we think about what's happening here? Because in a way, if we go back to that period when the international community really re-engaged in a big way in Afghanistan, everything was development, was humanitarian financing. And now we're in a situation where it's flipping to a need to move humanitarian back to humanitarian financing from what had been a lot of work in developing institutions. So that's the immediate term. And this is why this partnership of the ARTF donors is deciding this week about moving funds to WFP and to UNICEF. So that's a good sign. The more that we sort of have a conversation among the international community, among the community that had been the donors in Afghanistan, and think about how to move a little bit, right? It's helping those who are on the ground to do it. Now, if there's been an ongoing discussion about how we see that this assistance, this really important assistance that WFP is doing, will be a Band-Aid, but we know that a lot of work needs to be done on essential, basic, quite frankly, life-saving services in health, in livelihoods, and just to keep people going. And to do this is sometimes called humanitarian plus, it's sometimes called essential basic services. It's outcomes 2 and 3 in the UN's transition plan. So I'm mentioning this because there's an intense amount of coordination around it, but it won't work unless the payment issues are resolved. And there's sort of a range of ways that I think people working on the banking sector, working on the sanctions regime, working on the AML CFT issues have thought through, and they're kind of on a scale of how much political difficulty they would face getting through either the those who are looking at the sanctions regime or the current administration on the ground. I think Chris probably talked about the UN has found a way to bring in cash, which is not that different than what had been going on. The US Treasury had been bringing in cash before that. So this is a really good sign because now it's actually being distributed. Cash had been going in before, but now it's being distributed actually through one of the banking channels. So the more things get tried, the better. There's also some technical ideas around creating a way to support AFs to circulate in Afghanistan and among companies there who have been vetted and to be used for the humanitarian response with some payments to be made offshore so that money would not have to flow across. And then there's a lot of discussion about how to give more comfort to the correspondent banks. And that's really what it's going to take in the end. So it's all a work in progress. The situation is very dire. I think all of us wish it was moving faster, but it's complicated. And each step I think we have to be happy about and really recognize the work that WFP, UNICEF, and others are doing. Let me stop there and I can answer other questions. And again, sorry not to be there in person.
Thank you, Melinda. Any response to Melinda's comments from the panel? If you like to, or would you like to add anything else?
No, it's very clear, but there are two quick comments. One is that I understand that the physical presence of World Bank in Afghanistan is not there anymore, and people have moved to Islamabad. So in absence of having, counterparts there, how can you be delivering some of the financial assistance? That's number one. Second part is that I understand that I would like for the audience to know that what was the volume of financing of World Bank in the past few years and what is expected now in the year or two. I know it's a bit difficult question to predict, but I'm more keen to see that in absence of having an outfit there, how are you operational in Afghanistan?
And if I may add, this U.S. Office for Foreign Asset Control under the GL14 and GL15, they have provided certain concessions. So do you think that World Bank and of course through World Food Program would be able to utilize some of those concessions?
Thanks, all good questions, and Chris will probably want to come in on the latter one. So it is true that that most of the staff left. This is kind of how the World Bank policies work. We still have our office there, and we're still very much hoping that as the kind of authorizing environment and the politics around it sort of evolve, we will be able to go back. In the meantime, this is why I'm now back here in Pakistan. Islamabad was my home for many years, so it's good to be back again. And so we're working out of here. And the truth is, the activities that we're talking about now, we are doing with the UN. This is what happens in these situations. What is needed now is a humanitarian response. And that means that the information about the needs assessments is coming from the UN. Our coordination is with the UN. We've also for a long time had a third-party monitoring agent on the ground. Because in recent times, to go to the point about security being easier to manage now, in recent times, many missions were not able to go very far outside of Kabul. And so there's been a system in place for many years that allows information to flow through remote monitoring and through the reporting of this very strong network of third-party monitors. So that's also continuing. So, this is sort of being ready and to move when it becomes possible. But right now we're moving through the UN, and that is the right thing to do. And that's what happens in all of these situations around the world. The volume of financing was big. There's $4.2 billion committed, of which about half remained undispersed as of August 15th. About half of that is from the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is the collective of donors. And about half is from IDA, which is the World Bank financing window. The Asian Development Bank has a similar financing window. And so it's that amount, the undispersed amount, that this collective is looking at how to make the best use of. It's in current projects. And so that means unlocking some of it from current projects as we identify the ways to put it to use. Because I think part of the question was for you too, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Chris, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're lucky in many respects as a humanitarian organization because there are humanitarian exemptions to sanctions, and we operate in under sanctions regimes in a variety of different places around the world. So this isn't new for us, but look, the sanctions regime is clearly an impediment to the Taliban, but I do question whether or not it's a sufficient stick or the right stick to push them to fulfill their pledges. I mean, the approach, frankly, I think is tired. However much distaste there is for the Taliban, such measures are, they do prove to be a pretty blunt instrument, and particularly in Afghanistan. So, my sense is that we need to be a little bit more creative. We need to be a little bit bolder, but a little bit more constructive in the manner by which we engage. Punitive measures, they're not the way forward. I think the international banks must allow the transfer of funds into the country so that trade and economic activity can begin, because it's only really through that we're going to be able to generate the income and get livelihoods back up and running again, and to create the conditions that will allow for a proper political discourse. I mean, I may be speaking a little bit out of turn as a UN official here, but certainly, it would be silly of me, I think, not to use the opportunity of being able to express an opinion in this forum.
Melinda, how much time do you have got? Would you be staying for the rest of the panel?
I can stay for about 15 more minutes, and I'd love to hear the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
So I will request Ambassador Nigmana Hashmi, who was a former ambassador in China, one of the most experienced person when it comes to this regional development, how China perhaps would be looking at these developments. What is it that we should expect in this multipolar world? So 5 to 7 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning to everybody. First and foremost, let me thank the SDPI for giving me this opportunity to be here and talk to all of you. All of you can relate to this, and I'm sure our foreign guests here can also relate to it. We have our national poet, Allama Iqbal, who more than about 100 years ago, in one of his Persian poems, said that Asia is the heart of the world, and Afghanistan is the heart of Asia. And so when it is happy and stable, Asia is happy and stable. But when it pains and it ails, then Asia also suffers, because Asia is like the body and Afghanistan is like the heart. And we have now seen for over 40 years that the heart of Asia is not only ailing, but it's very sick. And let me say that maybe not always because of itself. This is an ailment that was brought upon this heart of Asia, first by the Soviets, then by the West, and then by a lot of other reasons that we are not discussing at this forum. But having said that, the West has tried for last 20 years, after having spent almost, some people say, over $6 trillion, to try and put Afghanistan in some kind of a direction. And we have now seen, after the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan, that whatever they were doing sounded good, sounded positive, sounded progressive. But now we realize that it really didn't work. There was definitely something that wasn't done in a proper manner. So what happened? After 20 years of trying to bring so-called democracy and development and raise the standard of human rights, we see that Afghanistan is worse than ever before. So I totally agree with my colleague, Mr. Christia, that maybe this is time to look at Afghanistan in a new light, to try new strategies, to try a new approach. My colleague, Mr. Sulheri said, gave the example, a very interesting example of hijacking of a plane. And in trying to explain what the situation of Afghanistan is these days, may I beg to disagree with him, because taking over of Taliban in Afghanistan is hardly a hijacking, because the powers that be negotiated with them for years in Doha to have this outcome. So I don't think that this is hijacking. This has been a facilitation of ways to hand Afghanistan over to the Afghan people. Now the most powerful group there seemed to be was the Taliban, so they took over. But I refuse to sort of believe that they have come without any tacit approval of the people who are, the powers in the world. Having said that, today, Afghanistan is the most destroyed country in the world. It is, the people are dying. You just heard Chris tell us that 1.8 million people are just one step away from starvation and from famine. So in that situation, humanitarian assistance with conditionalities make absolutely no sense to me. Because you can either say that you're trying to save the people who are dying, or you say, okay, we give you 2 months to see whether you are improving your human rights, particularly of women and children. So I think that is a very misplaced kind of an expectation from a country that is surviving to breathe. I will give you a very terrible example, but it really, these kinds of conditionalities, when you hear, it reminds you of what happened last year when the policemen were kneeling on the neck of this black person, and he was screaming, "Let me breathe." So I think Afghanistan at the moment is screaming, saying, "Let me breathe, let me live. It's only after I breathe and I can live that I can grow." So I think these conditionalities are very, very, and these expectations are very misplaced. Having said that, I would also like to say that I remember the pre-79 Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a democratic country, so I don't know what this entire debate about bringing democracy to Afghanistan is about. It has a democratic, it had a democratic constitution, and that constitution, I believe, is still there. So it is not that it was a country that was not in the international system, that wasn't democratic, and the people do not know what democracy is. That had quite an open society, far more open than we were in 79. And this was a country where women and children, and the country was going places. So to think and to portray a picture of Afghanistan as being a very backward and a very uneducated, a very barbaric kind of a land, I think is a little unfair. This is a tragedy that has been brought upon it from the outside. And because of that, I think there's a certain kind of responsibility that also rests upon these nations now to give them a little bit of breathing space, to grow. So I also agree with Chris that humanitarian assistance is one thing, but you will have to open up a little bit. As the Chinese say, you give a hungry man fish and you feed him for one day, but you give him a fishing rod and you feed him for the rest of his life. So there has to be some opening up. There has to be this ability and this chance given to Afghanistan to grow and to have some kind of an empowerment. The Taliban are there. You may not like them. A lot of people don't like them. Yes, they have their, but this is a new generation of Taliban. So I think a little bit of credit must be given to the fact that this is a different Afghanistan. This is a different dispensation. We saw Japan created havoc in the world. What happened? You negotiated, you gave a reconstruction package. Otherwise, this area would again have been in a state of chaos. Nazi Germany created havoc in Europe. You negotiated, you integrated them, you gave them a reconstruction package, see where they are today. You look at Northern Ireland and see the peace process surviving. So how come that when it comes to Afghanistan and Taliban, the rules are very, very different, or the policies are very different? The policies that have been followed in Afghanistan have failed. So maybe you go back to your old policies of reconstruction and enabling a country to go, because a hungry man is an angry man. I mean, you have to provide livelihood. You have to, and I think coming to the region, it is the responsibility of the region, because the West has repeatedly failed Afghanistan. So maybe it is now the regional countries that have to come together. And in that, I personally feel that China has a very big role to play for several reasons. It is not controversial in Afghanistan. It has played a very positive role throughout by providing the development assistance, and they have.
You can ask this question in conversation.
Okay, just let me just quickly.
Important argument that you're making.
Just 2 minutes. So maybe, and because it is now the future superpower of the world, that also, I think, a lot of responsibility rests now on China to lead the way, along with, of course, the Russians and the regional countries, to take Afghanistan out of the humanitarian crisis also. And in that, I think the international humanitarian organizations must also sort of liaise and deal with China, whether you like them or not. They're neighbors, and they have the capacity of doing it. And as far as one last thing, as far as human rights are concerned, I was ambassador to the EU before going to China for 5.5 years. So trust me, I know the various human rights debates and discussions. When it comes to humanitarian assistance, when it comes to saving people, there cannot be conditionalities. You have to first enable them to breathe, to survive, and to put them on some kind of a track towards some kind of a future before you can demand human rights of women and children. Because right now, Wendy mentioned that things are so bad that people are selling their daughters. So by putting conditionalities and expecting Afghanistan to deliver human rights in these conditions, they're not even complete in the Western world. So I think it's an unrealistic expectations. And by doing that, I think you're not saving the girls who are being sold. You are actually forcing more Afghans to sell their daughters, the same people that you are trying to save. So I think a different lens is required. Otherwise, the risks are great. If the same thing happened in the 90s, and the same thing will happen again. Afghanistan will spiral out of control. It will lead to maybe, civil war also, and a much more hatred towards the rest of the world. More terrorism can emanate from there, which is extremely bad, not only for the region, but for the for the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hashmi.
And then the refugees, I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, sure. For making a very powerful case for humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. I know, I'm sorry I was interrupting you in your very thought-provoking comments that you were making. One of the out-of-box solution that I could think of, Chris, you were mentioning of some innovative ideas, and I would like any four of you to pick, including Melinda, to pick to answer. World doesn't recognize Houthis in Yemen. President Hadi is sitting in Saudi Arabia, government in exile. But the Yemenis people, they are still able to get humanitarian assistance from international community. So providing humanitarian assistance, it doesn't proxy to be recognizing Houthis rule in Yemen. So if that sort of model can be replicable, okay, if we don't like Taliban's, then can't we have a government in exile, Ashraf Ghani sitting in Dubai? So if you think that Taliban's, they are unlawful rulers in Afghanistan, maybe you can take Ashraf Ghani as a legitimate ruler if you prefer him over Taliban. But
excuse me, haven't you had enough of Ghani
please,
and Karzai?
but that's what the thought-provoking question is. That can't we have a government in exile and you can keep on assisting the people in Afghanistan following the Yemeni model?
I think I would very quickly add to my fellow. I think the question is not Ghani or using a proxy. The question is that how to circumvent the existing restrictions to open the space. Okay, and honestly speaking, if you want it, people can find a way. Now, what could be a potential way? I would rather leave it to Wendy to respond. But perhaps, because as Nirmana Hashmi has said, that immediately fast-tracking humanitarian assistance would need a little non-traditional approach. Now, what could that be? I don't know. So maybe we can discuss it.
But a last comment. Getting a government in exile, is it of starting civil war and confusion in Afghanistan, and everything else will just slide back and it'll fall apart. So I think that we shouldn't even go down that route.
To make sure people can hear me. It's for the Afghan people to decide what type of government they want, to decide who they want to govern them. At the moment, we have a de facto administration that has achieved its role through an insurgency and a conflict. And certainly Canada's message to the administration, to the Taliban, and I think that of many of our partners, is that they now have to demonstrate that they are prepared to govern in such a way that they will answer to the needs of all of the people of Afghanistan, that they will be inclusive of ethnic minorities, of women, of religious minorities and others, so that they are truly representative of the Afghan people. While that process plays itself out, there is no question, and that we are 100% supportive of everything that Chris and his colleagues are doing, that there needs to be humanitarian support to the Afghan people. And I think there are a number of very flexible and innovative approaches that are being pursued in order to ensure that that humanitarian support is delivered. And frankly, for the Taliban administration to demonstrate their bona fides, that they have the interest of the people at heart, their demonstration that they're prepared to facilitate those means, that they will cooperate with those flexible measures, is one of the indicators that we're looking for as we move forward. The Taliban is a listed terrorist entity. The manner in which they prosecuted the conflict of the last 20 years is unacceptable to the international community. It is the onus is on them to demonstrate that they are no longer going to to follow or to use those particular means. The individuals that are in their administration that are culpable for crimes against humanity, for serious violations of human rights, should not be part of their government. We would like to see the Taliban acknowledge that. There are elements of the Taliban that have been playing a part. We would have liked to have seen a more productive process in Doha, but that they were playing a part in Doha. The critical element is that they themselves need to seize the initiative to demonstrate that they are going to govern in a responsible manner, that it is adhering to international law. A number of people will ask, frankly, some of the leadership in Pakistan has said to me, Wendy, you're looking for Afghanistan to become Canada or to become Sweden. We're not. We're looking for Afghanistan to be governed and to be in a position to answer the needs of its own people with a system of government and of the needs of the Afghan people, and that is consistent with the international obligations that Afghanistan itself has signed up to over the course of 50 or 60 years in various governments. Canada, like many other countries, we recognize states. We don't recognize governments. We have relationships with governments. We continue to recognize Afghanistan. There is no question that Afghanistan as an integral sovereign state continues to exist. What we are looking for is an administration in Afghanistan, again, that is answerable to the needs of its people. Until that situation is in place, we will be as flexible as we possibly can to make sure that we are addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. And so Canada is supporting WFP. We're supporting there are a variety of innovative, maybe Melinda can speak to this, the trust funds that are being established. And frankly, if the Taliban, again, is acting in the interest of its own people, it will facilitate the passage of those, that type of manner of assistance, of those supplies, of those financial assistance through to the people that need them most.
Very, very important, and thank you for raising that. But I also agree that remain engaged. But again, I would like people to think about that a country which has seen a 40 years of conflict. So we are looking at perhaps another 100 years, frankly speaking, for that goal to be achieved. That's, let's hope not. Anybody else have a comment? Perhaps
Chris,
we can take from people.
Maybe Chris. The one thing which I feel is important to recognize is that to all intent and purposes, Afghanistan now has peace. That's quite something. And I think we need to acknowledge and recognize that and counter this narrative that they didn't put up a fight. They didn't put up a fight because they wanted peace. They've got peace. And we need to respect that choice, because in many respects, it was a choice. Now, there are a whole variety of difficulties that come with that particular choice, which Wendy has very well explained, that need to be dealt with, I think, in terms of being able to ensure that the de facto authorities adhere to international law and gain the respect of the international community. But for the moment, let's respect the fact that the country has got peace, and it's been hard won, and do what we can to be able to, support those people. It's a justifiable gain. There's no question about that. And I think, frankly, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, very, very worthy of our support.
Up to people, there's one comment that which Ambassador Hashmi also mentioned, that China's leadership role in future. My take is that with this Cold War intensity between the US and China, how to bring at least China and the rest of the international community on a table to talk about it. At this point, it's just not happening. So with this comment, perhaps we should take some questions, and it's early morning.
Very interesting discussion, indeed. My question is like this: to trace the diversity, multi-ethnic and tribal societies, if we talk about, do you think that global responses would consider some critical studies before producing any feasibility report?
I'm tired, Hensa. And I quickly put my question to anyone, especially Haroon and Wendy. There was a corridor that the World Bank was building 20 years ago, east-west, for which the World Bank, Haroon, you were there, had even the toll and the freight and the trucking, everything. But suddenly this north-south corridor has come, which is CPEC, and that is replaced. And now CPEC is being connected to the. Do you think that actually arm twisting, which is Afghanistan going on, is not on humanitarian or the standard of Taliban, but on the trade? Because US want that trade to be led through east-west corridor, for which the Russia and the Soviet Union came. And now China has already taken the lead, invested in the mining in lithium and all that. So anyone can answer.
Alaikum. I have a rather harsh question, and I apologize for putting it in front of someone like Wendy, who's so nice. Wendy, who decides which killing is justified, which persecution is justified, and which is not? I have this article by Anand Gopal open in front of me, and I did this entire research in rural Afghanistan, where women have turned against the allied forces because of the killing by them. And we say that we condition our assistance to the Taliban government, to the Afghanistan, on how humanity, how much considerate they are about human rights in the country. We have seen at the time of the US withdrawal how Afghans were falling off the sky, and the West was more concerned about taking their soldiers out of the country. We have seen how US missile killed.
I think if we could be brief in the interest of time, we got the question. So if you could just.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the first question about, a multi-ethnic and tribal society, how do you actually approach Afghanistan? We can ask Melinda that perhaps World Bank has done some analysis. If she's online. Otherwise, perhaps Chris, do you want to give it a go? That in a difficult environment like Afghanistan, you are delivering food assistance. So how do you deal with ethnicity and tribal pressures?
Well, as humanitarians, we work according to humanitarian principles. We're neutral, we're impartial, we operate independently. Our concern is being able to address vulnerability, simple. So we make no distinction between ethnicity. End of story, really. It's people.
You don't. So second question is linked to Tahir's question about the corridors. I'll quickly answer that. I think over the years, it was the Eurasian Corridor, which was talked about in Heart of Asia process and Istanbul process and other processes. And but that was about 2 decades back. Then later on, because of the geopolitics, 2-3 changes took place. And the East-West Corridor was talked about by the Americans. And also, if you remember, the Tapi pipeline came into picture instead of Pakistan, Iran, India pipeline to Afghanistan. So that shifted there because of the political issues. I was amused actually just 2 weeks back. Rand Corporation wrote to me that we want to revive the East-West Corridor. So all I'm trying to say is a fundamental question that in regional connectivity or a regional market grouping, one country takes the lead with not only professional capability, but putting a funded transaction on table. So China put in a funded transaction on table that here's a BRI, X amount of money is also backing it. In ASEAN, Japan did that. This talk of East-West Corridor has no funding. Who will put money behind it? So unless you put money behind it and expertise behind it, nobody will take it seriously. That's my take. Last question to Wendy, that on human rights violations, who makes the judgment? I think that was the question.
Indeed. I mean, I'll speak first to maybe take a couple of the elements of the others. Certainly Chris has given an excellent response on the driver for humanitarian assistance, which must by definition be impartial and be needs driven. That's what Canada supports. That's what the other humanitarian donors support. The East-West corridor versus North-South corridor, Haroon is absolutely right. These things get developed because there are interests at play that are willing to put the money up to develop the infrastructure. It's not, and I apologize, sir, if I'm coming across sounding critical, but I hear a lot of the undertone in many of the debates around Afghanistan that somehow there is this vast conspiracy out there that's looking for access, you know, the entire conflict was related to mineral rights, or that we are only engaged in Afghanistan because we think that there's something very much self-interested for us in a commercial sense, which I think, if you will excuse me the diplomatic term, is a bit bollocks. It's fundamentally, Afghanistan, the international community has been in Afghanistan for the last 20 years because of the fact that it was a source for transnational terrorism. It caused significant instability and security to Western interests, and we responded. We all, when I say we, the donor community, Western interests, I think, frankly, the international community, want a peaceful and stable Afghanistan that can first and foremost answer to the needs of its own citizens. And secondly, be a positive contributor to regional security, to international stability. If Afghanistan is able and really looking out for its own self-interest, of course it will want to be open to international investment. It will want to create a functioning economy in which people can have jobs. It will want to be an effective regional partner for Pakistan, for Iran, for Central Asia, in order to allow the transit and movement of goods, because that's what responsible countries do in the international community. And this is frankly at the heart of all of our interests. And I go, ma'am, to your question on the side, the tragedy of the last 40 plus years in Afghanistan is that conflict is never simple. When a war is being prosecuted, there are mistakes, there are tragedies. In particular, there are civilian casualties that happen that are the unintended consequence of pursuing a particular ambition militarily, which is why, frankly, a military solution should never be the answer. But where there is a fundamental security challenge, it must be responded to. For the West, we absolutely, I mean, when Canada's military forces were in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2012, which was the bulk of our military commitment, there were mistakes made. Canada took casualties. There were casualties that happened as a result of the conflict. We regret each and every one of them. But our fundamental driver was trying to support Afghanistan to be stable, to be peaceful, to respond, and I keep saying this, to the needs of its own citizens, and fundamentally, so that it does not export instability, terrorism to other countries, which then becomes a driver for international instability. So the fact that Afghanistan is now more peaceful than it ever has been, certainly for the last 50 years, is a positive thing. We welcome that. You know, while we perhaps would have certainly chosen a negotiated outcome to come from Doha as opposed to a military solution, the fact that there was a military solution, that the last month or so of the conflict did not result in the casualties that were expected by the international community, is something to be built on. It's positive for Afghanistan. Now simply, we want the administration in Kabul, we want the de facto government in Afghanistan to demonstrate that it's looking out for the interests of all of its people. For women, more than 50% of the population, for ethnic minorities, for religious minorities that also want to have a stake and a voice in government. If that were to happen, if the administration demonstrates that it's committed to that outcome, there will be an Afghanistan that is a positive force for this region's stability and for the international community. I think that's what we all hope for.
Last round of question from the floor, Zara.
Yeah, thank you. My question to all the panelists is, there any such suggestions of a collectively high-powered diplomatic delegation from highly resourced countries like G20 under consideration to have a collective effort in order to provide a sustainable aid for the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan?
Anyone from the back?
Yes, thank you very much, Mahmoud Khwaja, SDPI, but my comments may please be taken personal. I have a very short brief questions to Her Excellency, the High Commissioner, but before that, I wish to absolutely support what the former Madam Ambassador said. This is no time for conditionalities. I mean, the devastated country, people starving, and let them breathe before you bring in any conditionality. And if at all any conditionality is necessary, that should be with regard to the unity among the Afghans. That this unity started when the Russian left, and it continued until the American left. There must be internal and external factors to bring that unity back. And then finally, I mean, it's a mindset, it's perception. You can't solve that or remove that by starving them or by killing them. I mean, the solution to that is a dialogue. Let there be an open dialogue between the scholars of Afghanistan and the scholars of non-Afghan world to come out with what the Islam is, to tell that extremism is not Islam and what they are doing is not Islamic. I think when we need an international open dialogue on the very perception what they have, which are wrong and which are incorrect. And my question to you is, you emphasize the money of donors directly going to the recipients. Would you elaborate a little bit? What are your concerns? To whom this will go if it is not going to the recipients? You showed that reservation. Would you like to explain that reservation? Thank you very much.
Gentleman over there on the table.
This is Amjad Hussain, a student of Politics and International Relations. My question is from Ambassador Wendy and Mr. Chris. It is short but sharp question. Just like NATO, the West always make alliances to bombard nations like Afghanistan. When will they become so altruistic and welcoming, altruistic in assistance and welcoming in accepting the refugees?
Last question from there. Okay, ma'am. Oh, there, back.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Munir Ahmed, and I'm really pro immediate humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan because they are starving. But my question is, do you believe, if all the panelists, that what could be the process or the mechanism to ensure human rights afterwards? Because we believe there is the regime of hardliners, and that is proved that whenever they are given breathing space and they are strengthened, they have to change the entire socio-political conditions in their country. And this is my question, please.
Mariam, your last comment.
Thank you, Mariam Shabir, and I am representing STPI. My social media team was just tweeting whatever the panelists were saying, and that's where this question just popped up. They were typing Afghanistan, and Twitter was, spamming, either deleting their tweets, letting them speak in favor of Afghanistan. My question is that in such situations, like either be it Afghanistan or any other country where crises are happening, this social media diplomacy is really needed. How we can really sensitize Facebook or Twitter or platforms like that, I shouldn't be using the word sensitize because they are, but how do we deal with them in such situation?
Who sets their standards?
Okay, so I think Wendy, first question was G20. I think that's the Geneva process. Perhaps you want to say a word on that. That is there a shared diplomatic discussion to deal with the situation.
So we'll all do a couple of minutes of as Abid as you wish. I missed. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, I think that's better. So I would, because this will be the last time I speak, just to say again, a huge thank you to SPDI for this conference, for the opportunity to have a forum like this in which diverse views can be heard and we can have a debate. I think that's really important. That's one of the things that frankly we would encourage in Afghanistan, that there need to be diverse voices at the table to be able to freely express different points of view. And that will be the platform upon which the government can move forward. The international donor community is working fully, collectively in support of the humanitarian agencies, of which Chris represents WFP as the primary one. And we are pooling our funds, as we always do, in order to try and create the financial resources necessary to get humanitarian assistance where it's needed most. One of the questions speaks to sort of the conditionality and what are we trying, I think what we're trying to avoid. I mean, at the moment for Canada, I can say it is illegal for us to provide funds directly to the Taliban. They remain a listed terrorist entity. They remain subject to United Nations Security Council resolutions that prevent our providing monetary support directly to them. So we have to find mechanisms in which we can funnel our support directly to the Afghan people so that it is not to the benefit of a Taliban administration until such time as that Taliban administration demonstrates that it is, one, prepared to move past the terrorist tactics that it has applied before, and number two, that it is prepared to be inclusive and that its distribution of resources will go equally to, number one, impartially to those who need it most, and that it will go equally to girls and women as well as men and boys. That has not been demonstrated yet. That's what we're looking for. Until that happens, we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that resources go to the people that are in need. And to do that, we work through our humanitarian partners.
I think all of us can take 2 minutes to close the session. My take is that I think it's very heartening to hear that while on one end, the group of G20 and other countries are talking about, how to improve governance, inclusive governance in Afghanistan. You can't put a timeline on that. That's my, very clear, candid view. I still believe that if we take the economic lens in a country where there is a very young labor force with very little hope for the future, the chances of influencing Afghan people is much higher, rather than taking an approach of conflict and geopolitical proxies, which has been taken for years. Countries are not ready for it, and Pakistan is not ready for it. But Pakistan has looked at Afghanistan from a security lens. And when we talk about economics, it's actually the security people who talk economics with each other. So it's a very funny situation that, when I was doing this CASA 1000 other projects, so whenever it came to a dialogue between countries, it was either the foreign ministry or actually the security people who would say, okay, let us talk about it. But that's not the way to give economics a priority. Now in China, there's a different approach. China has started engaging with neighbors with an economic lens, which is basically infrastructure development lens. Let's see in future how far it goes. But I think giving some direction of economic revival, this political coalition and getting back to democratic governance, nobody really knows how long it will take.
Very briefly, I think the consensus there is that humanitarian assistance is required, and it's required now. And the best is without conditionalities, and innovative ways must be found to ensure that the people survive, particularly this winter, because if this winter they don't survive, then any hope of peace returning to Afghanistan will become very doubtful. And as I said in my intervention, I totally agree with Mr. Harun Sharif that it is time that we look at Afghanistan with the lens of economic development and reconstruction, and we do another Marshall Plan or MacArthur Plan or whatever, to really lift Afghanistan out of poverty, because poverty is the main cause of extremism, of fundamentalism, of civil strife, everything. So if you provide education, food, the normal tools of development, people will become normal of Afghanistan the way they used to be. And having said that, I think their cultural and their ethnic traditions and their values must be honored, particularly, as I said, I've served in the EU for over 5 years. They pride themselves in their value systems. So each country has its own value system that must be respected, and of course, making sure that everybody is included and whatever. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, we need to work as a community of nations. I think the problem that we've had in Afghanistan has been it's been Afghanistan against the West, the Taliban against the West, and we need to break out of that mold. There was a question around whether or not there was going to be a high-powered meeting to take place that will help address the problems there. And it's great that Pakistan is going to be hosting a meeting of the OIC in a week or 10 days time. That's what we need. We need to ensure that the organization of Islamic community come together as part of the international community to help Afghanistan. It is going to be the collective nation states of the world that is going to help address the needs of the people of that country. It's not just going to be the Western traditional donors through humanitarian aid. And I think that's where we need to push and use all the media channels. I don't know whether Facebook or any of the other social media platforms are necessarily the right thing to be using, in all honesty. Personally, I feel as though what we're getting there is a polarization of opinions through social media. But anyway, that's another debate altogether. The good news, I think, is that Pakistan is certainly doing its part and facilitating, at least in the immediate term, I think the bringing together of some very, very important players next week to really think about and try to address the problem.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm quite notorious for exploiting my friendships. And we have with us Syed Naveed Qamar, who is serving his 7th term in National Assembly, one of the veteran parliament from Pakistan People's Party. So we know the opinion of government on Afghanistan. Before concluding it, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes from Naveed Qamar Saab, just to get an idea that what sort of solution Pakistan People's Party is proposing on this whole situation, so that we could gauge whether opposition and Treasury benches, they are on the same page on this very particular. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you pulled the fast one, Abid, because I came here to listen, not to talk. I think by and large, the consensus that you see generally evolving around here is what any political party in Pakistan would stand for. Yes, we stand for emancipation of women, the education of women, the provision of healthcare, and all, and that not just in Afghanistan, but it is a priority even for us in Pakistan, more than what a lot of our other colleagues do. However, that should not be at the cost of the people, the real needy, the people who are starving, because that's the reality on the ground. That's the reality of people not only not having enough to eat, but when we keep talking about sending girls to schools, then we have to ensure that there are teachers who are paid to go and teach in those very schools, or there are doctors and healthcare workers who are paid to go into the clinics and the hospitals to be able to. So the solutions that we are looking at is not just providing the food today, it is also to have enough inflow of funds in the hands of Afghan people, which will actually drive the wheel of the economy. It's not the governments necessarily that need to be either funded or the funds to flow through the governments, but definitely you need the funds there. Somebody mentioned the Benazir Income Support Program. That is if the infrastructure was there, that's probably a good way of channeling funds, which will bring in a multiplier effect. Unfortunately, the backbone of Nadra that you have in Pakistan does not exist there. So I don't know, maybe if we go back to the times when we started this project, we had no Nadra system either. So yeah, there are ways of actually channeling the money without having necessarily, it's not the best of ways, but it can be done. So having said that, I think, yes, we stand for helping the Afghan people in whatever way we can as Pakistan, as well as we as part of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, please give me a round of applause for the distinguished panelists here for a very candid discussion that they had. As I said, that it was just one of the three discussions that we would be holding around Afghanistan and Afghanistan today. And the reason we are conducting this discussion is very relevant to the theme of our conference. When we talk of beyond the pandemics, leaving no one behind, we feel that South Asia would extremely lag behind in achieving its sustainable development goals if Afghanistan is not included there. So we need to somehow identify the ways and means that when we say leaving no one behind, we don't leave any nation behind in achieving the 17 goals, which are fundamental rights to every citizen on this planet. Thank you very much and hope to see you in the next session. And thanks to all, dear ladies and gentlemen.